All right, so we've come back again to the second chapter of the handbook. Today we're going to introduce you to some of our kind of 20th century heroes of the faith. I'm thinking of people like Hildegard and Ernest Weinhardt. I'm thinking of people like John Carlsen and Adolphus Gunderson. Names that you're not likely to remember, but these are the people that really kind of made us who we are in the early part of the 20th century. So let's go back to the handbook, and there we're going to read a couple of paragraphs from chapter 2, and you'll just see how they lead right into this very formative, very important period of history in the early years of our organization. There you've got it, handbook, section 2. We're going to read a couple of paragraphs, starting with paragraph 5. The World Mission Prayer League grew out of a God-given burden to pray for the unreached interiors of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So how did that happen? We'll tell that story today. How could these people come to faith unless they hear the gospel? How could they hear unless the gospel is preached? And how could the message be preached unless someone is sent to preach it? Okay, paragraph 6. In the mid-1930s, a band of students, pastors, and friends in the Minneapolis area, all right, most of them were at the Lutheran Bible Institute in Minneapolis, they joined together in prayer to the Lord of the harvest that he would send laborers into his harvest. Soon, some of them felt called to join the harvest themselves. We'll tell that story. They had names like Ernest and John and others. In paragraph 7, volunteers approached the mission boards of the existing Lutheran synods, but found no budget for new outreach. This is an important thing about the history of the World Mission Prayer League, too. I mean, we didn't set out to create an independent missionary agency. We went, first of all, to the synods of the church and volunteered for service among them, describing the burden that many of our early mothers and fathers felt. And the church said, well, okay, that's great. We don't have budget for it. So in 1937, they organized themselves along simple lines to accept missionary volunteers and send them into areas of special concern. They were committed to finding a way to send and go in mission without the constraint of budgetary limitations. They were committed to providing a way for lay participation in mission without the requirement of ordination. They were committed as well to complement the regular work of the Lutheran synods without diverting means or personnel from their programs. So there we have it, a sketchy few sentences in the handbook, but behind it is a story of dynamism and daring and adventure that really make us who we are. Well, here's one of the characters that we'll tell about today. His name is Ernest Weinhardt. He was born in 1900, just at the turn of the century, and died a young man in 1946. Ernest Weinhardt. He was married to another of our heroes. Her name was Hildegard. So Ernest Weinhardt was the author of a kind of foundational vision. It almost became a kind of charter for the World Mission Prayer League in our early years. He had a vision while he was a missionary in Western Africa in October of 1929. And in just a few minutes, we're gonna describe that vision for you. But that vision also had a kind of historical root, a kind of an historical milieu out of which it arose. So we'll describe that to you first. The Weinhardts, as it turns out, were members of a little missionary agency called the Gunderson Mission. This has its own particular kind of history. It was founded in 1917 by a Lutheran layman, a guy from Iowa, I think, whose name was Adolphus Gunderson, 1917. He had been a missionary in the eastern part of the continent, serving with an organization called SIM. And somehow or another, he had become super burdened with the unreached on the western side of the continent, in what is today places like the Cameroon. He pled with with SIM to begin work there. And somehow or another, the time wasn't right. So Gunderson set out on his own and founded this thing called the Gunderson Mission. And they set up shop in what's today Cameroon, and what in those days was known as the Western Sudan. Still to this day, the Lutheran Church in the Cameroon counts Gunderson and our own Weinhardts as among their founders and pioneers. You know, just as an aside, this is the way mission so often works. Someone or another gets a kind of burden for some area of the world, or some people group, or some unreached frontier, or some particular spiritual need, and they just can't, it just becomes something that has to give birth in them. They can't let it alone. It doesn't let them alone until finally, I mean, it's like a fire that gets shut up in their bones, and they can't get rid of it until it gives birth to something. That's what happened to Gunderson. And as it turns out, that's what happened with the Weinhardts, too. So there they were in the Western Sudan of Africa, in what's today Cameroon, in a little town called Mbula. And they were young and committed and fiery and passionate Lutheran missionaries from Minnesota. Here you have a picture of Andrew Auckland on the left-hand side of the screen, and then our own Ernest Weinhardt on the right-hand side of the screen. There he was. He was a kind of a diminutive sort of a guy, and kind of an unhealthy kind of a guy. He had lots of health problems, and in fact, as you saw in his bio data, he died in 1946, just at 46 years old. So there you have Ernest and Hildegaard on the left-hand side of the screen. There you see old man Gunderson and old lady Gunderson right in the middle, and their sidekick, Andrew Auckland, on the right-hand side. And here's another picture from 1929 from Mbula in what is today Cameroon, with our own famous missionary sitting there on the left-hand side of the screen. I'm glad we don't do mission this way any longer. Anyhow, in October of 1929, good old Ernest Weinhardt had his vision. And this was the vision that kind of became like a charter for the World Mission Prayer League. You'll read the story of it in The Spirit of God Was Moving by Millie Tengbom. She writes on page 9, "In the Western Sudan of Africa, slightly built, brown-haired, blue-eyed Ernest Weinhardt sat at his rough wooden table, recording in his slanted handwriting the conviction from God which had gripped his soul." It had 12 paragraphs, and I'm going to organize it in 3 sort of subheadings. The first is that Weinhardt pictured a movement rooted in the church. He pictured that God would take out of the Lutheran Church a large number of men and women as missionaries, that this work would take on such a spirit and proportion to eventually involve all the Lutheran churches in America, and that this be a mighty factor in uniting the believers of the Lutherans, of the various synods of the Lutheran Church. So it's a slice of the church, it's the Lutheran Church, but Ernest Weinhardt pictured something that was rooted in the church, part of the church, nothing other than the church of Jesus in the world. He had a vision of a missionary movement rooted in the church. He had a vision of a missionary movement that was focused on the frontiers. His vision was that these missionaries occupy the yet unreached territories in the hearts of Africa, Asia, and South America. Down in the archives of the World Mission Prayer League on Clifton Avenue, we have Ernest Weinhardt's actual journal where he recorded this vision from 1929. And there you can see that he has sketched out those 3 continents and kind of circled the interiors of these continents. They represented for him the frontiers. This guy wants to go where no one has gone before. that these men and women be serve with the primary purpose of praying for the conviction of sin and conversion. And then the third piece of this vision was that he was looking for something that was committed to prayer. He wrote that these should be taken out directly by God, that these should be provided for materially in answer to prayer, that these be received directly in answer to prayer, and that these missionaries be preeminently men and women of the cross, of the Spirit, of the Word, and of prayer. So there were 12 paragraphs in his vision, and we can summarize them in this way. They were rooted in the church. They're focused on the frontiers. They're committed to prayer. Weinhardt also adds this interesting note. It's the 8th paragraph, that this work be looked upon as a definite task to be completed within a definite period of time. So there's the vision. Now, in 1931, Weinhardt goes back to Minneapolis. He's not so well. He's kind of a sickly sort of fellow. And he becomes pastor of a church that became Redeemer Lutheran Church in Fridley. And then he began to associate with the Lutheran Bible Institute down in Minneapolis. And there he wound up connecting with none other than John Carlsen. This was a young Norwegian guy, Norwegian immigrant, who was a student at the Lutheran Bible Institute in Minneapolis. Let me read for you a paragraph out of Millie Tengbom's book. Carlsen, his full round face, which quickly broke into smiles and often erupted in hearty laughter, grew more and more sober as he passed day after day of facing the needs of people without knowledge of Jesus Christ. Impulsive, visionary, demonstrative, and sometimes stubborn and difficult to work with, John Carlsen was at the Bible school not as a matter of personal preference. He had come only because he felt that this was where God wanted him. In Norway, he had enjoyed teaming up with his brother in the fishing industry. But when an economic depression hit, their business failed. John left Norway and came to Milwaukee seeking work. His first job was at Alice Chalmers. His second was in a photographer's studio restoring portraits. And then he wound up at the Lutheran Bible Institute in Minneapolis. So here's a picture of the Lutheran Bible Institute student body from 1941. I'm telling you, this was really something. Look at that. Look at those people. There was a huge spiritual revival going on throughout the Lutheran Church. And there was huge spiritual vitality at the Lutheran Bible Institute in Minneapolis. This building still stands. It's today called Minnesota Teen Challenge, but it was built as the Lutheran Bible Institute. Carlsen was a student there. So in the fall of 1932, John Carlsen and many other students participated in a mission survey course taught by a guy by the name of Clarence Granlund. And this was a phenomenon. People prayed, people cried, people wept, people were moved with the needs of the world. And out of that, in the fall of 1932, was created a prayer movement that met on the campus of the Bible Institute and here and there around the city. They called themselves eventually the South American Mission Prayer League. Ernest Weinhardt got connected with Carlsen and those students and faculty who were praying, well, for South America, of all things. So now, all right, you're going to wonder, why South America? Granlund's emphasis on South America really goes back to an event that happened a few years before in 1910 in Edinburgh, Scotland. In 1910, a huge conference was organized. Here's a picture of it. It's organized by a guy by the name of John Mott. John Mott purposed to bring together all of the missionary leadership of the church and mission all around the world, to meet in Edinburgh and to sort of chart where they had come until then and to project into the 20th century what work yet remained to be done. So if you had a magnifying glass, you would be able to look into the crowd there in Edinburgh, and you would notice some very, very obvious things about it. There were no Africans involved in this. I mean, they wanted to bring together people that represented the church and the mission of God all around the world. There were no Africans there. There was just a handful of Asians, I think only 2 or 3. And Latin America was entirely off the agenda of this gathering in 1910. South America was not considered. The hosts of the event in Edinburgh were Anglicans, and they believed that South America, being a baptized continent for the most part, really was evangelized already. And it made no sense to tell good news, to preach good news, to try to plant churches in a place like Latin America. So they insisted that Latin America must not be considered at Edinburgh in 1910. And it wasn't. It was just withdrawn from the agenda altogether. A lot of people from America in particular felt that this was an oversight. And there were a number of kind of follow-on congresses after the Edinburgh event in 1910 that were held in Latin America to talk about the work that remained to be done in Latin America. There was a follow-on conference in Panama in 1916. There were follow-on conferences in Lima and in Santiago and in Buenos Aires and in Rio de Janeiro and in Havana and in San Juan. And out of it, new societies were born to try to do mission, to try to reach out in a continent among peoples and cultures that a lot of people felt were kind of getting short shrift and overlooked. So this was also true in Clarence Granlund's classroom. So a prayer movement came out of his class. In 1932, they began to meet on Thursday nights. And for the better part of a decade, they met every Thursday night to pray for South America. They eventually called themselves the South American Mission Prayer League. Why South America? From our newsletter in December of 1937, why are we going to South America? Because South America is one of the most needy and neglected fields in the world today. So Weinhardt and Carlsen met together and organized the South American Mission Prayer League to send missionaries in May of 1937. And they were commissioned to Bolivia on December 5th, 1937. They left for the West Coast on December 13th. Weinhardt did, and Carlsen followed on December 30th. And on February 18th, 1938, they climbed aboard the SS Margaret Johnson, headed to South America. And the rest, is history.